Okay, hello everybody, good morning. For today's HBL, we're going to look at cultural policies, especially the arts, and we're just going to focus on Mao's PRC from the period of 49 to 76. And really, usually when you think about cultural policies, it's a paper two kind of question. So, if you can remember when we talk about Hitler and discuss about it and arts, basically, when you think about Mao and for Hitler, the definition of arts is similar. So, it will involve things like literature, for example, the literary book, painting, sculptures, music, theater, dance, film, and architecture. So, all these are part of the arts. So for the CCP, obviously they realize that culture is a very important means to influence people's thinking and also saw it as a reflection of the society in which it had developed. And so culture obviously plays a very important role in influencing people. And when we think about Western culture, at least for the CCP during the early years, did not like Western culture at all. Was seen as degenerate, decadent, a kind of bourgeoisie kind of culture. And basically, they felt that Western culture had penetrated into Chinese culture, manifesting through cultural imperialism. So obviously, they had a disdain for Western culture. At the same time, they felt that traditional culture was considered out of place in a socialist society, which maybe from their point of view should be somewhat modern or a reflection of revolutionary culture. So traditional literature, plays, operas were seen as China's feudal past. And later on, you see during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of this traditional Chinese culture, they sought to try to eradicate. So, what was Mao's aims? Basically, for Mao, in order to build this socialist society, obviously you need to mold the people into a particular consciousness, and this means this new revolutionary culture that emphasizes a few things: class struggle, hopefully struggle against imperialism, and bring out the goodness of people, the goodness of the peasant, the goodness of the worker, and obviously, all these people will help to contribute in building this socialist society. So let's look at paintings. So we're looking at page 15 of your notes right now. So in Mao's words, he said that artists were to create art for the people. And Mao will took inspiration, or the artists will take inspiration from Soviet style of social realism. Okay, and therefore through socialism you will promote obviously certain communist ideas. So if you look at this piece of painting, okay, obviously it promotes certain socialist ideas, the worker working hard, industrialization as part of the socialist country. And so these kind of paintings were depicted and seen everywhere. And of course, during the Cultural Revolution, artists were forced to adopt a style called revolutionary romanticism. So, who are the heroes now? The heroes are the workers, the soldiers, and peasants. And this will replace traditional Chinese subjects, whereby in the past, traditional Chinese painters like to focus on landscapes or birds or flowers, animals. But now the switch, and you see that basically paintings will depict these new so-called heroes, right? So you can see an example of heroes being depicted, right? The worker, okay, and of course, all of them carrying Mao's little red book. Then when you think about theater and opera, of course, there'll be a committee set up to manage this. And when you think about opera in China, actually, you know, for a very long time, Beijing Opera was one of the most popular in so-called in China. And the old opera was actually still being performed in the PRC. I mean, it's seen as a powerful tradition, right? So this is the what we call the Beijing Opera. But of course, during the Cultural Revolution, the CCP especially Jiang Qing, will argue that opera and culture should portray class heroes. And so Jiang Qing will develop her own revolutionary operas and plays. And he tried to persuade Mao that Chinese culture needed to be revolutionized. Jiang Qing was opposed by the Ministry of Culture initially, but she did succeed in 1964 in persuading the CCP to set up a five-man group to coordinate work on cultural reform. So initially, it was not that easy. It's not like immediately, you can see all these revolutionary plays. But later on, of course, during the Cultural Revolution, you see that Jiang Qing's influence would become stronger, right? Now, then when we think about the countryside, okay, so basically in the countryside, of course, the peasants need to be entertained. And so there was this thing known as the agitprop performers who will put up shows and plays which villagers are required to sit through. So what are the themes of some of these plays? Basically, you realize that the themes will revolve around obviously the class struggle between the peasant and the landlords, right? And so these plays and shows were performed in halls and public spaces. And the message is always like this, right? You're under the cruel life of the landlords. You are abused, but who comes and save the day? Mao and the CCP. And after they save the day, of course, all of us will be happy and all of us will come together collectively and start to farm together. So usually the plays will go on these lines. Other plays that come about, as mentioned, revolutionary plays. So you see this a lot during the Cultural Revolution. For example, one of the play is things like the Legend of the Red Lantern. There's another play, Raid on the White Tiger Regiment, okay, depicting obviously the soldiers, okay, and other plays like Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy. So all these are what we call revolutionary plays. Now moving on, then we have sculptures. So these sculptures play a huge role. Statues of Mao being created, usually the typical Mao waving, and of course dressed in this overcoat. And so, for example, in 68, a statue of Mao was built in Tianfu Square, Chengdu. All right, and you can see another example of a Mao statue in front of this so-called museum in Sichuan. Okay, 1970, a statue titled "Long Live the Victory of Mao Zedong" was also built. And you can see at the bottom of the statue, you can see again the depiction of the workers, the peasants, all, in some sense, all the people that obviously Mao would deem as revolutionary heroes. Another interesting statue, the head of Chairman Mao, 2007 Changsha. And if you go to China, you will continue to see all these so-called interesting Mao statues. Now, then we move on to music. We're now on page 17. So, in the early 50s, there was a crackdown on traditional and Western cultural influences. For example, also in Shanghai, nightclubs were closed, jazz music was banned because jazz music was considered Western music in some sense. And during the Cultural Revolution, as we learned this, musicians sent to labor camps, they were denied tools, the pianists and string players were made to stretch the ground. So there was a persecution of so-called the musicians. Chinese orchestra, of course, not allowed to perform Western music because Western music, again, a symbol of cultural imperialism. Now then, for literature, there's the Thought Reform Campaign as well. And again, a severe crackdown on traditional and Western cultural influences. So publishers and editors register with the government and obviously need to support regular reports on their work to ensure that their work conform to things that the PRC will accept. A lot of the public libraries were stripped of Western novels, traditional books, and even there was a book burning kind of activity. For example, in Shantou in 1953, whereby around 300,000 books were burned for 3 days. And then, of course, the literature that we all are familiar with, that the workers and the peasants, and in fact, almost everybody in China was supposed to read. All right, and 750 million copies distributed, nearly everyone getting a copy. And of course, they learn about Mao Zedong thought. And the impact, of course, was devastating, all right? Because of the fact that everyone is streamlined to learn Mao Zedong thought and certain revolutionary culture and so on, China became a cultural desert because the writers, the intellectuals, obviously were persecuted and there was obviously a lack of diversity. All right, sale of traditional foreign literature was banned, and possession of this was evidence that you are counter-revolutionary, and therefore it can be considered crime. And so, if you are caught with this literature or anything that's Western in nature, even especially during the Cultural Revolution, you will definitely be persecuted. All right, libraries and museums closed. A lot of the artifacts and books were destroyed, especially during the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. Okay, a picture of books piling up and of course being destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, as because these books were basically seen as old culture. Now, then we think about cinema and films. When the CCP came into power, obviously they recognized that film was a very powerful propaganda medium. All right, and the efforts were made to rebuild the Shanghai film industry. You must understand that Shanghai was a bustling city, and there were a lot of actually good films produced in Shanghai before 1949. Right, so the private studios in Shanghai, a lot of them were taken over and run by state-run film studios. And then Chinese filmmakers obviously were sent to the Soviet Union to study about Soviet filmmaking techniques. And a Ministry of Culture was established with a steering committee to oversee the film industry to ensure that films were produced that will support state aims. So we see censorship taking place, banning of Hollywood films, but of course Russian films were promoted. But interestingly, during the period of 49 to 65, the Chinese film industry actually flourished. And there were films that were produced, like you can see there, about 603 films, 8,000 over documentaries and new reels were produced. And interestingly, many animated films aimed at children were also produced. And the CCP paid for mobile projection units, so these projections can be moved around to bring films to the peasants, and of course, peasants that can be entertained and so on, and they can view these films free of charge. And when you think about the film, now you might think that everything would be revolutionary films, but interestingly, in 1965 there was actually this production of The Monkey God, all right? And this was the last major animated film of the second golden era of the cinema of China. And after that, of course, with the Cultural Revolution, everything was shut down. And of course, that was really moved towards so-called revolutionary films. But till 65, right? The film industry actually allowed a bit of diversity. And it's interesting to note that this film, The Monkey God, it became really a classic, and depicting, of course, traditional stories, but it was allowed actually during Mao's time until the Cultural Revolution. During the 100 Flowers campaign, of course, there was a period whereby films would be critical of the regime, but in general, the Chinese film industry was steered into safe political channels during the period, especially after the persecution. And of course, during the Cultural Revolution, as mentioned, cinemas were only allowed to put on revolutionary films. So the film industry, interesting, is not like it's totally, censorship. At the start, they allow a bit of traditional films to take place. Monkey God is an example of a typical film that was produced. But of course, as the Cultural Revolution progressed, then greater censorship. Films that, of course, promote Mao and promote the state were definitely produced. And of course, the classic example you can use is the Yangtze River movie released in August 1966, where I see Mao swimming in the river. Now, then we move on to the last one, architecture. So when we think about architecture, obviously architecture also will portray certain ideas. 59, we see the 10 great buildings were built in Beijing to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. And so these are the 10 buildings, all right? The Great Hall of the People, the National Museum of China, and the list goes on. Now, what are some of these so-called characteristics of these so-called buildings and architecture? Well, basically, the architects of the 10 great buildings use three basic styles: modernism, But again, going back to Russia, so social realism as expressed in Stalinist architecture and a form of historicism based on traditional architecture. So this is interesting, whereby you see a blend of tradition and also Russian Stalinist architecture. So let's look at it and view it. So when you think about architecture for communism, one classic example is that you need to build big. All right. So for Mao Zedong, I want to build the biggest square, even bigger than Russia. So Tiananmen was expanded. Okay, and of course, a symbol of of greatness. This is an example of, again, this kind of modern Stalinist kind of structure. Okay, the Great Hall of the People, which houses the National People's Congress. And interestingly, inside the Great Hall of the People, there's a traditional painting, okay, by this artist known as Fu Baoshi. You can see it at the so-called at the back. And Fu Baoshi was a traditional painter in some sense. I mean, you can see traditional ink, a mountain landscape. But of course, Fu Baoshi was admired by Mao. And this traditional landscape depicts Mao's poem, okay, and in some sense about the Long March. And so, Mao allowed it, even though it's traditional painting per se, but yet it somehow is grand and, it talks about Mao's poem. And so this kind of painting, interestingly, was accepted. Okay, another so-called painting was accepted. The Land is So Rich and Beautiful by Fu Baoshi and Guang Shangye in 1959. So again, this is considered a bit traditional painting, but with a bit of hint of modernism into it. And Mao allowed it because it was spectacular. All right. Another painting by Fu Baoshi. Interestingly, I mean, this is using traditional ink, a bit of modern to it, but yet depicting industrialization, the power lines. And so Mao allowed it. So Fu Baoshi was actually one of the artists that Mao actually, in some sense, loved a lot. And now, if you go to the so-called auction houses, Fu Baoshi's paintings are in the millions, right? Another example of architecture that symbolizes, grandeur and Stalinist architecture, the Beijing Workers' Stadium, completed in 1959 as part of the 10 great buildings. Unfortunately, later on, this area was also an area whereby mass executions were carried out. But interestingly, during the Beijing Olympics, it was one of the stadiums being used. And this is the part whereby I want to talk about the blend between Chinese tradition and Soviet Stalinist architecture. So this is the Beijing railway station built in 1959, again, one of the 10 so-called architectural buildings. And you can see Chinese architecture, okay, the roofs, but yet blended in with Soviet Stalinist architecture that's modern. Okay, and so it's interesting that China, had this kind of hybrid that took place. And I guess that's the beauty of culture. We think that this is Chinese culture, but yet there's this synthesis that will take place and something unique emerges. And of course, if you look at this picture of the railway station, what's important, of course, is Mao's portrait right in the center of that building. Of course, in Singapore, we also have our architecture. We have the durian, we have the three joysticks, and we have our amazing lotus. Again, interesting portrayals of Singapore culture, I hope and I believe. Now, so we come to the end of this lesson. I want you to start thinking about this question, which is possible but hard. If you compare and contrast cultural policies of two authoritarian states, what are some similarities you think you can find between Mao and Hitler and the Nazi state? And what are some differences you think you can find? And when we think about comparing and contrasting, of course, we can look at the different mediums. We can compare and contrast the paintings, the theater, the sculptures, the music, literature, cinema, and films, and architecture. And as you compare and contrast, you will notice certain similarities, but you will also notice certain differences. All right, so this comes to the end of my lesson. So have a good weekend, everybody, and I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye.